Let's start with a talk of Fanny. Thank you very much for having accepted the invitation, and enjoy yourself.
Thank you, Emmanuelle, and good afternoon, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to say that it's a great honor for me to be invited to talk to the McDonald Institute, and I would like to warmly thank Emmanuelle for organizing those seminars. I am also especially grateful to you, Louise Ørensen, for accepting this discussion, although, as you know, I am definitely not a specialist of identity. However, this topic is large enough for all archaeologists to feel deeply involved, as in fine we are all looking for the identity of humans and human societies. So the topic of identity is extremely vast, if not limitless. Identity is obviously plural, with two major components: the individual identity, built through lifespan and which might continue or even be reconstructed after death thanks to the memory of the living. The other component being the collective identity built over a continual process of evolution. Due to reciprocal dynamics, individual and collective identity are in continual interactions. As a result, identity is multiple, indivisible, and mutable. Moreover, identity is subjective, as it implies a sense of belonging or not belonging. These two parameters make the approach of identity challenging in archaeology, and especially in prehistory. In France, as far as I know, there is no proper archaeology of identity, but the question of identity is omnipresent. The concept of identity is embedded in a global discussions on population studies, social issues, or interaction between humans and their environment. My current research lab, which is also the lab of Emmanuelle, named Ethnologie Préhistorique, was created in 1946 by Professor André Leroy-Gourhan, who was a former ethnologist and developed an original approach of prehistoric societies, which has an enormous impact on the question of identity in France. He promoted accurate and comprehensive technique of dig and recording in order to be able to reveal social inferences at different scales through the reconstruction of spatial dynamics. For Leroy-Gourhan, the artifact in itself is meaningless if its relation to other objects is unknown. The discovery of the Magdalenian site of Vendredi in the 60s permitted him to develop those techniques and train several generations of researchers. Préhistoire, located next to the Seine River, was occupied repeatedly, but for short-term occupation, covered by seasonal layer of silt, which prevented palimpsest phenomenon and provided exceptional conditions of study. At the same time, Leroy-Gourhan developed the concept of operational chain opératoire, that enabled to question human evolution on the long term through technical processes. Refitting were emphasized in order to reconstruct the spatial dynamics and understand the organization of the different tasks and the agents' interaction within the settlement at different scales. For instance, you have here around the same hearth, Napper's circulation, and on the right, at the scale of the complete site at a specific level, meaning at a specific time. In France, explicit reference to theoretical models, if present, will be made at the very end of the study, at the last step of the interpretation, which is expected to be first built from high-resolution analysis. And for instance, you have the case of model gender space that was tried by Françoise Audouze on the Magdalenian settlement of Vendredi, which has the same condition of formation and taphonomy than Préhistoire. The holistic ambition of Leroy-Gourhan had a critical influence on prehistoric studies in France. All field together: technical studies, environmental studies, or archaeology and anthropology. The necessity of detailed reconstruction has over the years resulted in a high degree of specialization of French archaeologists, and in a sense it has also contributed to moving the holistic target further away. Physical anthropology has also benefited of these changes. Specifically, the University of Bordeaux 1, where I was trained and where I did my PhD, put a strong emphasis on methodological approaches in the field during lab work and during interpretation step. Archaeoanthropology, which is defined as an integrated approach of osteoarchaeology and funerary archaeology, was developed. And as I define myself as an archaeoanthropologist, but that I know that in English it doesn't really make sense. But there is a tight relation, as you know, between the biological and the cultural factors during the construction of the body, including the skeleton, through lifespan. Cultural habits have a feedback action on the physical body. For instance, the construction of gender will be based mainly on the biological sex, but gender behaviors will then have an impact on the body over time. And we must bear in mind that these biocultural inferences during the past will have a strong impact at different levels of our anthropological study at present time. So, as Emmanuelle told you, I am a specialist of the Natufian population who occupies the Levant at the end of the Pleistocene. They are hunter-gatherers, and some of them are sedentary. A lot of researchers are working on the Natufian population, on the Natufian culture, and my aim today is certainly not to present you a comprehensive synthesis on that population, but at the contrary to select few elements of my own research in relation with identity. My question that I was, when I was writing this seminar was, is it really reasonable as an archaeoanthropologist working on the Natufians to look for identity? The Natufians are represented by about 450 individuals, which is the biggest population known so far for the Pleistocene. But the Natufian period spread over 400 decades, meaning that, in average, each decade is represented by about one individual, 1.1 individual. It means that the Natufian skeletons available today is an extremely small sample of the past Natufian population due to the fact that some were not buried, others were not preserved, or not identified during fieldwork or during lab work, and I have my part of responsibility on that, and I will tell you later why, and others were not discovered. If we study the skeletons as a whole, as it is often the case in anthropological literature, the results are necessarily unrepresentative and distorted, as it just represents a palimpsest of individual data. In my opinion, in order to avoid this pitfall, we must focus on our analysis on coherent units. The most reliable units is the individual scale. But already at this level, it might be an issue to identify one individual amongst a commingled pile of bones. And often we will get only a partial skeleton, meaning a partial osteological identity. So one individual is the most reliable, but can we understand societal dynamics and cultural processes from individual stories? I think that we must work on recurrences and long term in order to find robust patterns and extract significant data. This is why we must define carefully other reliable clusters step by step. Maybe in starting of the comparing individuals from the same grave, and wonder if it's a long-term sequence of burials, or if it's simultaneous deaths and deposits. Then we can maybe compare people from the same level of occupation, and of course higher will be the resolution of the dig, better will be the chance to compare sub-contemporaneous people. Then we might look at people from the same site, but we should always question the fact, is the function of the site the same during all this period? And then maybe look at the cultural horizon unit, but we again need to be sure or question the fact that a cultural horizon might not represent strictly chronological times, as you know, the rhythm of evolution can be different from one site to another. So C14 data are really important and should be multiplied. Thus, it appears that the construction of these relevant units is actually a complex task, and it raises a critical paradox which is unlikely to be resolved soon. The larger the defined unit of study, the lesser is its historical reliability, but the stronger is its statistical relevance. A second major issue is to understand if our collection is a random sample of the initial population or not. It is not the case for the Natufian. If it was random, the available sample should follow the distribution by age class and sex expected. But compared to the number of adults, we lack at least 80% of the infants and 50% of the dead before 5 years old. The changing rates of selection according to phases and to sites show that it is not simply a matter of taphonomy. Moreover, we miss about 50% of the women. Although unsexed skeletons are numerous, exclusion or at least selection from sites of the women from the sites is obvious in several cases. So at least we lack part of the woman. It means that we lack part of the adults, and that consequently the miss of children under 5 years old is even more important than I previously said. Some burial places are clearly dedicated to selected part of the population, as it is the case during the early Natufian of Ionian Cave, where in this case all the skeletons were sexed. I could give a sex to all of them. So what about these 3 females that are together with these 12 males? Were they considered as males, or were they considered as having specific status? We don't know. But I think it's the kind of question we should ask. So questioning the identity of our sample is a necessary prerequisite, especially in prehistoric context, such as the Natufian type. The burial phenomenon might still be a marginal treatment of corpses among other more traditional ones inherited from the Upper Paleolithic. The sample we have is a small portion of a culturally selected part of the initial population. Sex and age determination from skeletal data are fundamental to approach identity, but regrettably, some physical anthropologists often prefer accuracy than reliability. At the contrary, it is our duty to inform archaeologists that our methods are not accurate enough to give precise results. In short, sex assessment is reliable today only for old adolescents and adults if the pelvis bone is preserved. The younger the skeleton, the better is age assessment. And over 30 years, aging is performed through the evaluation of senescence, determined by a complex set of genes, culture, hormones, and environment, meaning that senescence is particularly difficult to translate in terms of chronological age. It implies that the unknown sex category must not be forgotten during interpretative step, that for adults, adoption of broad classes as young, mature, old adults seems more reliable, and that we should keep in mind that elderly adults are always under-identified. In case of plural grave and commingled skeletons, we should remember that the estimation of the minimal number of individuals will depend on many factors, and that the MNI of images will be usually closer to the real number of individuals than the MNI of adults, for which individualization is difficult. In conclusion, individuals, females, males, the elderly and children are not equally recognized due to methodological limits. Data consistency requires a return to primary material in order to apply the consistent methods and strategy of clustering and be able to compare groups and subgroups. In addition, for all other osteological criteria for individual or group differentiation, contextual analyses are necessary. When discussing biological relatedness, or behaviors and lifestyle, or quality of life. There is a huge literature concerning the reconstruction of physical activity through the study of bones remodeling dynamic, and specifically enthesopathy, what we call musculoskeletal stress markers. There was a big enthusiasm in the 90s about this kind of approaches. But passing the years, strong contradiction appears between the different observations. In fact, their direct links to muscle activity was questioned. Moreover, we know today that their development depends on multifactorial parameters as hormones, age, body mass, and pathological conditions. It's becoming increasingly apparent that simplistic interpretation of MSM as reliable indicators of habitual adult activities are scientifically untenable, as said by experts of the question. And I personally wonder if it's relevant to look for clear, dominant, and ultra-repetitive activities among prehistoric individuals, as recurring gestures through lifespan integrated into a fixed operating process and mass production are quite unlikely in Natufian context, and probably other prehistoric contexts as well. In my view, questioning habitual position from patterns as osteoarthritis, for instance, is more promising at first. But to identify specific movements and activities, I think it should require intensive discussion with archaeologists, experts in tools and techniques. Themselves have sometimes doubt about the function of the tools they study, and even more on their mode of hafting, holding, and how frequently they were manufactured, used, and discarded. So contextual approaches should be promoted through specific individuals. Do the physical characteristics of the dead buried with a specific toolset match the task specialization expected? This individual approach was not done yet in Natufian context, and it's also because we have very few cases of clear association between tools and human remains. Personally, I prefer to work on direct evidences of activities or behaviors. Teeth are one of these direct evidences. During the Natufian period, we do find regularly traces on the teeth showing that they were used as tools by women and males in an opportunistic way. However, at one of the sites, Malaha, they were used by two old males, using their teeth much more than others. I think they were involved in a form of task specialization linked to plant processing. Over the years, the dental arch, very damaged, was rendered inappropriate for mastication, and they must have been considered as a disabled person. Evulsion is another factor of identity, especially interesting because it's a claimed identity, visible and permanent through life. In comparing the rate of antemortem loss of central incisors with other categories of teeth, it's become clear that it's a deliberate extraction, which is very important to show and to prove. Then, looking at different reliable archaeological units, the characteristic of this treatment is better understood. It concerns adolescents and older individuals, both sexes, only 17% of the sub-adult and adult population. There is a clear geographical pattern as it appears in the south during the early Natufian and spread to the northern sites only at the end of the Natufian, and it disappears with the Neolithic in this area. In fact, these different archaeological units permit to detect different scales of identity. The regional identity, where you have present evolution or not present, site identity or community identity, where evolution can be either symmetrical with two teeth extracted or asymmetrical, age, and it might also be an identity that continues through death, as we found several of these persons with evolution buried together. Because it is linked to age, we can wonder if evolution is part of a rite of passage towards adulthood, as many other groups worldwide until today. It is not a trivial treatment. It impacts seriously eating and speaking abilities, and the operation of extraction itself might provoke, in addition to strong pain, infection and sometimes death. Stress markers on teeth are revealing other issues. Linear hypoplasia is a stress marker which temporarily arrests dental development. In modern population, its frequency is strongly correlated with socioeconomic level. As teeth are not remodeled over time, linear hypoplasia is a witness of the childhood condition. During the Natufian, we have a strong variability of hypoplasia according to site, to phases, to age, and in one site, the site of Nara-Lorraine, it's correlated to sex, to sexes. How can we interpret these sexual discrepancies? Females may have been physiologically less sensitive to hypoplasia, but this is not shown in modern population. Little girls receive better treatment and food supplies than little boys. Women buried on site were selected since childhood and favored, and are not representative of all the female population of the site. Or women buried at Nara-Lorraine lived their childhood at another site with better condition of life. And today, unfortunately, I cannot answer, but I would like to insist on the fact that the individual residence is not static, and the place of burial might not be representative of the place of life, and this is another factor of bias in studying and comparing prehistoric subgroups. Sexual differences are also true for the rate of caries among the Natufian living, for instance, on the site of Malara. Caries are linked to many individual factors, like age, properties of saliva, resistance of the tooth enamel, etc., etc. It is also linked to diet and diet behaviors, like the composition of the drink water, steadiness of the meals, regularity of the meals, etc., etc. The determining factor is the diet rich in sugars. Because of these numerous individual factors, I think that we should study group versus individual data. Comparison should be involve subgroup of comparable ages and environments. And this is what I did in Malara, and this is why, in this case, I think that gender diet behaviors is finally the most likely. Women had probably a different diet from males, with more sugar and or less protein intakes. And that fit quite well with ethnographic models. Few words now on funerary practices. Are position and orientation of corpses linked to biological identity during the Natufian? Burial position and orientation do not seem to be linked to age or sex, but it's linked to places. If you are buried in a cave or in open areas, that's not the same position. It's linked to phases with more and more constrained position over time. It's a link to specific events with a witness of something like looks like a form of staging of the grave. So it's not only funeral practices, it's graves that mean something and want to say something. It's linked to sites, and it is also, I think, linked to individual identity, because there is no strict standardization, and there is a real care given to the corpse final position during the whole period of the Natufian. It means that each scale of study gives a new insight into the complexity of the criteria involved in burial position. It is particularly true as well while looking at the ornaments. If we combine several categories of data, it is apparent that many aspects are interrelated and that a single explanation for the role they played is irrelevant. Categories of beads, their quantity, and their location on the body are site-specific. Among the individuals decorated, some belongs to simultaneous burials, up to 8 bodies, and from which only one will be ornamented. Generally speaking, most of the beads are worn by young males, but there are remarkable exceptions. Altogether, the exact role of ornaments cannot be clearly determined, but their high ritual and collective identity values seem obvious and likely above any kind of individual status. Cluster of burial reveal other interesting aspects of identity during the Natufian. First of all, the analysis of discrete anatomical traits shows that biological kinship is important and plays a role in the organization of the dead, if not the living. In those families, burials identified in several places during the early Natufian. In those family burials identified in several places during the early Natufian, it seems that all age groups and both sexes are included in the burial cluster. Association of individuals within the same structure reveals that the pattern of deposition of the corpses is guided by strict rules. We have adjacent deposits, which concerns male and female in very tight association, with the forearm of the male placed on the abdomen of the female. This is the example on the left. On the right, at the opposite, it's a case of superimposed corpses which concern 2 adults placed directly on the top of each other, but in individual funerary bags. Both of them are males, and they are sharing a strong kinship link, which is witnessed by several discrete traits they have in common, rare discrete traits. Those cases of superimposed corpses are not very numerous yet, but some recurrences are already observed with a continuity through the Natufian period, and it includes individual shroud or container, similar position, either adults with babies or individuals close in age. It can be 2 children, 2 adolescents, or 2 adults. And for the moment, we have only males involved. And even in the case of one double burial of children, the sex was determined by DNA, and it was two males. Interestingly, children under 2 years old, if not in single pits, are associated with males only. But of course, as I told you, we are missing most of the women and most of the children. So it might not be the norm. I mean, the women and the babies can be together, clustered, not in another place, but in a different kind of funerary practices, not involving inhumation actually. But what we have on site is that babies are always with males. That I wanted to show you that during the late Natufian, it seems that on the site of Malara we have a clear shift in the social structure, at least what we can say from the funeral practices. And we have the emergence of a cemetery, so I call cemetery an area dedicated to the dead for several generations and at a distance of the dwellings. And for me this is not clear at the early Natufian, but it became clear during the late Natufian. The burial pits are similar for everyone and whatever the number of dead buried, so is that the body must adapt to the existent to the structure, maybe already existent. Jean Perrault, that has dug these graves, thinks that they were former silos. Graves are always plural with successive deposits, and all children under 1 year old are excluded, and some structures are really dedicated to a specific class age class. And then remains are manipulated over time, and individual identity is lost for collective assemblage. Graves are marked and visible in the landscape. So it is actually very standardized practices that appear in the late Natufian. And it seems that the biological family that we have seen in the early Natufian disappear, and maybe is more dissolved, and that for more collective identity. And the dead became, for a while, a collective entity, accessible, perennial, and visible in the landscape, like the funerary space itself. And interestingly, this cemetery does not correspond to a reinforcement of sedentarity life, as we could think. But at the contrary, it corresponds to a return to more mobile life, and which is apparently contemporary with the younger Dryas, the climatic event of the younger Dryas. So I would like to finish with this last example. It's about a grave found in a house, a structure from the very end of the Natufian at Malara again. The place was first used as a pyrotechnical area with many hearths, maybe 4 hearths, I don't remember exactly, and later was transformed as a dwelling. Meanwhile, a grave was placed within the structure on the floor, and at the same time, 2 post holes were built. The individual is an adult woman. She was placed in a narrow coffin. Shortly after corpse decay, the coffin was reopened, the bones were reorganized, and the uppermost bones were taken off, and the structure was transformed into a dwelling. Napping activities were performed on top of the grave at 2 major work posts. Given the short time span between these 2 actions, I believe that it's not a coincidence and that the place of the dead woman has shaped the spatial organization of the dwelling activities. It is an individual story, but it's not an isolated case. And I think it shows really the importance of the dead and the relation between living and dead, and the role those formers may have played in the process of sedentarization and neolithization. So in conclusion, should we approach identity through prehistoric skeletons? Yes, I think it is worth the effort. However, in my point of view, it's critical to consider all sources of methodological bias in order to overcome limitations. Consider biology and culture as an integral and indivisible whole at all stages of the study. Scales of study must be flexible according to bias and data. We should look for robust, repetitive patterns through detailed studies and focus on intentionality and planned actions. We should also accept the fact that new discoveries might change the results, as representativeness will always be an issue. I believe we should promote comprehensive and contextual analysis, meticulous reconstruction of data and societal and historical dynamics, and developed ongoing dialogue with other fields of expertise. Thank you very much for your attention.
I understood my task to be to think about gender and identity through how my work has developed. So I'm sorry it's a very me-focused presentation I'm doing. The question I was first presented was inside prehistoric society. It sounds terrible. But then it became to identity and individuality in prehistory, which was a little bit more doable. But then the title I was actually given was Gender and Identity in Prehistory, and that I thought at least I could attempt to think about. In terms of influences, I started doing gender back in the 1980s. So there were things like Meg Conkey, Elizabeth Arvin Norbert, The Context of Action, and had read more about difference. Judith Butler and Rosemary Joyce about performativity, and Thomas Lecour, Foucault, etc. Philosophers, I've been interested in philosophy. I like the attention some of the feminist philosophers gave to the language itself and how language add meaning to what it is we talk about. And from anthropology, I think I mainly got the idea of sort of, as everyone in archaeology, being cautious about the diversity of cultural forms. I've been looking at design studies because I've been really interested in work in design studies about how domesticity is gendered or objects are gendered and why that is. Then generally feminism and gender studies. From museology I got ideas about the gaze, how we look at things. And from sociology I dipped into various arguments about body. So as anyone in archaeology, I think what we're very good at is drawing in inspiration, arguments, sometimes just a single sentence or a little bit of a discussion, and then twisting around and make it useful for the thing we want to look at. I started doing gender research in the 1980s, and I think it's developed into three more or less clear fields. One is about the discussion about gender and sex in any context. There's also some discussion of philosophy of knowledge, which is sometimes less acknowledged, and then there's the historiography itself, about visibility and visibility. It's a lot of the beginning of gender research, of course, came from that push for making people both in the present and in the past visible. And in terms of this former one, it's a whole discussion of how gender is actually constructed, introducing notions about negotiation, materiality, performativity, and citation. But also the middle bit about how we conduct research. And there is quite a big discussion, which sometimes get rather too extreme, and much of the time is a bit silence, about how we as individuals, but also as social beings, might affect our research, and whether that means that your own gender, your own standpoint and position in society affect the way you would understand anything. And in a slightly complicated way, it introduces a sense of relativity. So it gives some challenge to how you want to see a gender research or feminist research in terms of archaeology. In terms of what I've been doing, I've been looking at Bronze Age identities, expressions of that. I particularly look at age and gender. I've been looking at what I call body ideologies and chains, and I've also looked at the means of identification. What is it which actually create those structures? In terms of philosophy of knowledge, I'm sure Graham can remember the sort of, certainly we were allowed to write academic research with the I, where you say, I think this is important, while our generation was brought up to that you don't speak in personal, you write in neutral. But for example, Henrietta Moore was very much part of the generation of feminists who say it is personal, research is personal. It's also an acknowledgement of instability, which is an interesting idea, I think, and maybe also research as a journey rather than research as a product. I've been involved in so-called excavating women, doing historiography of women, and then sort of the debates on the different, how we respond to the different waves of feminism. Anyway, when we then bring this to archaeology, I felt that one could maybe see it as if there's sort of three facets to trying to get into discussion about identity. First is to understand identity as we just learned, as this complex thing, something that's fluid, multiple, the intersectionality, which people are now talking about, interconnectedness. It's not a simple thing we actually trying to look at. So that need to be broken down. Oh, I'm sorry, there's something wrong with our projector. It cuts the bottom of pages now. But also then the attention towards how it's actually structured, the action, social practices, and the last word is meaning and significance. The kind of that it's not enough to say we have gender or identity. You also need to engage with what that means. How are they constructed? How are they performed? That this is not something which is static. If gender is fluid, it means that all the time practice is involved in confirming and negotiating that identity. And that gets us to my third element, which is the materiality, our praxis and agency in a different theoretical argument which have been in archaeology. In that sense, I think fits in and speak to the question of identity. So I do this very, very briefly because we already had a very good account. So here I talked about social identity, but collective or communal identity. We use slightly different terms there, but it's clear that there is this difference between a personal identity and identities which are performed at a different scale, and where there's a dynamic there which is very important to recognize. It's also enormously important to recognize that the self is continuously changing, undergoing the life cycle, while the social can be quite static in certain periods, very sort of rigid in terms of this is how society are. So we have a slight tension in any society between those two levels, and I think archaeology is sometimes a bit sloppy about being clear about whether it's personal or social or collective or communal we're talking about. But then the third element is the mechanism through which identity formation latches on to cultural forms, whether that's tangible or intangible. Because if these are just in people's head, that's one thing. It's when they get connected to resources and expressions and symbols, they take on quite a different level of complexity and significance. The reason why I think this is an important aspect of archaeological work, or us working with trying to comprehend past society, is that this is indeed a very important aspect of how society functions. It can be it's through those kind of argument about identity that you connect people in various ways, that you create relationships, you legitimize and organize society. And there can be very strong motivating forces, both as cohesive forces, but also in terms of divisions. And I think therefore if you want to talk about tradition or change or evolution, underlying those processes at some level we get into issue about social relations, which open up questions about identity. So I'll just give you a few examples of how I try to struggle with this over the years. This is a study I did quite a while ago of a very early Bronze Age grave, which is called Leubingen in Northern Europe, and it was dug in 1899, and it's a fantastic grave. But when you start looking through it, you see that you can maybe think about a construction like that as a performance between individuals or specialists and the larger community. So the very first stage is actually preparing a wide platform, cleaning the grass and stamping the ground and that kind of thing, where you need a lot of people. Then you have a stage of constructing this tiny little burial chamber, which is really quite small, very specific. Lots of good timber, handicraft knowledge is being invested in that. It's not something that anyone could just do. So there you get a specialist knowledge and also a very intimate space. And then you get a mount of stone put over that. But when you read the report, you get the sense, you can see that these are stones of different colors, which would have come from different parts of the environment. So it opens up the possibility that this is a part of the building where extended community bring their resources in to help building the barrow. And that's something after I did this study, we actually had some graves where that can be proven. And then the final part is the big sort of piling up of earth, which you can see it leading to a huge fest, but where you don't have anyone who have to design it very carefully. So I thought what a case like that gives you is the sort of theatrical play between the specific individuals and the community, but also different kinds of community, and the importance that kind of events have in terms of defining who people are and who it is who will be involved in constructing this. I also looked at the burial itself. This is this fantastic burial inside this little chamber, and where we have one body with another body laid sort of crossover, and then a number of ornaments and objects, tools and vessels. And you can see the tools have the same patterns of crossover as the two bodies have. So it is, I don't know, I hope you can see. You can see here with the daggers and even the pins. So you have again this sort of sense of a very choreographed display of a person. And I was sort of, as a suggestion, saying that these are different fields, that you have an area which is about who that person is, and that's earrings and gold and so on. And the few princely graves all have those earrings. And then another area are small tools and hand weapons, things which might belong to the person, but they're not attached to that body. And then agricultural tools, and then over here you have the pottery. So there's a sense of, I may be wrong in my specific interpretation, but there's clearly a sense of a choreographed space. Not everything is there randomly, but actually rather specific. So you can only get this sort of glimpse of that this, when it was done meaningfully. It was done as a kind of a symbolic practice. So one get this individual standing out as a focus for a whole range of social expressions. The other kind of study I've been doing is looking at objects in the codification of the difference between bodies. And I'm sure this kind of picture there is familiar to you. Sort of 100 years ago, this is just a farm out in the countryside, but you can see the difference in the clothes between the women working in the field and the women working in the kitchen. Or you can look at Downton Abbey or something like that, and the costume indicate their roles within the hierarchy of a house like that. And it is very largely the clothing, which make it visible to everyone what role they have. And that, of course, does not need to be all the time. We can also have here where different identities of gender blend more, but it's not uncommon. And even if you go to medieval period, have a lot of laws about what different social group, what kind of clothing they can wear to make sure that those social differences are controlled. So, and that raises those sort of questions of what grave goods actually are. What are they? What are they used for? How do they change with time? What are they used to articulate? And how much can we talk about that in terms of performance and performative body? And I think in some way one can see that there are different kinds of grave goods. There are things that seem to be put in as a gift or something like that, but there are also things which are there as almost like an annotation of the body. This is part of expressing who that particular body is. And so this sort of, in my period, in the Bronze Age, you can go through major zones of Europe where there actually is a lot of coherence about what happens. It's different objects and different wealth, and you can see issue about age, about when they start to acquire those kind of identities. So I did this study for now a long time ago, 20 years ago, where in southern Germany, as you go through different parts, the different major regions, within each region you would find that the women have either costume focused on the waist, a costume focused over the chest. So that pattern you find in each region, even if the objects themselves are typologically different. They're making their own, but they are using them to bigger shared schema about how women appear. And what was interesting there is that women are divided into two different groups of women. And it's not based, it seems, on, for example, on age, not simply based on age. So it could be based, for example, on whether you have had a child, or sort of other aspect. If you go into some African ethnography, they sometimes talk about instead of sort of age stages, they talk about moral stages. You have to get to a point, you have accomplished certain things, and that changes who you are. So the big surprise was, I think, that it's not just that we see children growing into women. I then worked a bit more with these ideas about the objects as a way of annotating the body, where I thought one could think about what the object's the shape, what kind of object it is, but also how they combine, and also the placement on the body. So if you look at this early Bronze Age object over here, which is very, very typical of early Bronze Age object, that doesn't have any particular relationship to the body. It can be used, it can be broken up and recombined in different ways, and we know that from England, that it's been, some of the elements are used as heirloom, it seems, but it can also be twisted up and used around the arm, or it can be around the neck or around the waist. It's not fixed on the body. Where what we get in the Middle Bronze Age, particularly in Central and Northern Europe, are objects which are made for a particular part of the body. So these arm rings here could not be used around the neck. It cannot even be used around the ankle. So you have things which are made for the ankle, things for the arm, sometimes for the lower arms and upper arm, and for the neck rings. And I thought that's where we get into a sense of a connection between body and ornaments, where those ornaments are used to articulate something about bodiness. So I just want to, and when I looked at that, what happened, I was sort of arguing that we get body-specific types, but in addition to that, we very typical also get a principle of multiplication. So some of the difference between graves is not whether they have those, but how many they have of those. Do you have one arm ring, or do you have 3 arm rings on each arm? And there's also a very high degree of symmetry, and that's what I'm showing on this one. So you would have a lot of dress outfits, way of presenting the body, which sort of emphasize the two sides, the symmetrical body. And then we have this, which I'd like to get time to go back and study, these ankle rings, which are just astonishing in terms of thinking about body politics or body technology, how you, in the Bronze Age, can have objects like that. What does that mean about those women? Are these the most prestige women of your society who don't do labor, or do they do labor nonetheless? So I came up with this idea of body tropes, that you actually have different ways of understanding the body. So behind this we have all the individual biological bodies that we were just seeing, but it's almost like as a layer above that, you also can have a cultural ideology about how those bodies are understood. And I think what we see in the Middle Bronze Age is a very united body when we are in Central Europe. And it's quite interesting that British Bronze Age scholars, some of them argue that in Britain we have a very dividable body. But the ornaments in Britain don't develop. They continue the same way as the early Bronze Age. It's mainly beads and so on. So they don't have this kind of objects. Again, my specific interpretation can be twisted and disagreed with, but I think the observation is very valid. There's something, there is a relationship between object and body which is becoming very specific. and last during the Metal Bronze Age, and then it doesn't continue in this area, continue in the very north. And it is interesting for us to see this not just as grave goods, but to see it and not just about individual, but also about bodies being seen to be particular kinds of body in terms of social norms. So what I've been working on more recently, which I think is fantastic, if I just had time to do research, it's very, very difficult to find the time. But I've gone back to something I looked at in my PhD, with this fantastic big, you can get as big as this bronze hanging vessels they're called, which are carried on the belt, like either front or back, and which that's the top is on the Bronze Age here, we down in period 6, which is the same as Hallstatt, so down around 500 BC. They are huge, and again, sort of, carrying around like that, they're heavy. It's quite a special thing you're doing to the body. But when you look at them, you also start to see it's actually quite complex to try to understand what's going on. And we all associated them with Scandinavia, but when you look at the distribution, they're focused on Scandinavia, but they go much further, both south down to as far as middle Germany, west into Holland. They are distributed quite wide. So I tried to look at a lot of the spatial characteristics, a lot of changes through time, and qualities of casting and decoration and all that kind of thing. And you just get a sense this is in no way produced centrally. This is something craft people in a lot of different places are making their version of a shared idea. So I therefore tried to come up with the two things I was interested in. I was interested in thinking about something I call distributed identities, that you share identity with someone else who has similar things to you, or that you imagine have similar things to you. Because in each area you come to, there'll just be one of them. It's not that you have a center. It's not like if you go down at the same time to the Eastern Mediterranean, where you can get the sense of center and power and wealth. This is the objects are very, very widespread. They're quite scattered. So I think we have to think about what they do and what is going on in different ways. So I was partly working with this idea that the things confirm each other by being known about or talked about or imagined, rather than necessarily being in the same place. And then I've also been working with the idea of identification, which in terms of psychology is really a very old-fashioned word, so it's nothing fancy in that way. But I'm a little bit worried that we have been starting to talk about identity as if it's something you just possess, and that's it. So it's interesting to see if we can open it up and focus more on the practice that goes into acquiring identity, and that I've talked about that as identification. So getting access to and having this kind of objects, I think is a process of identification with what they stand for. And looking at them, it turned out that a lot of them are repaired, and quite a lot of them are also very heavily worn. And when you then start to, there's simple modeling of lifespan, you realize that probably a lot of these were used much longer than the person who originally had it. So I think we are really getting onto things which at time were heirlooms. And that interesting thing when it's the objects which connect people, rather than people just having objects. Oh, I think that's interesting. So, I think, so for me it has been a really exciting journey in terms of questions of identity and gender. They're complex questions. I think they're really of great significance for our ability to work with archaeology. Sometimes you sort of acknowledge it and put it to the side while you're working with something else, but it's not that, it's so obviously part of how society is constructed, and part of the sort of the motor which runs society. But there are also a lot of challenges. So in terms of the particular issue, I think one could ask about where gender archaeology is now. I think it's a bit faded. I think it's resting a bit on some, by now, slightly old argument, rather than continuously critical engagement with it. And I think that, for example, there's a lack of clarity or a lack of energy in discussing the relationship between feminism and gender archaeology. I think a lot of the discussion in feminism about the relationship between sex and gender, I think we kind of lost track of, for example, and therefore we be a bit stuck in saying biology is natural and sex is biology and sex is natural and gender is cultural, and that's it. And as people work more on it and what is problematic and what is easy about that statement, I think we could benefit from returning to. So in particular, this difference between, that's why I put this picture up, because for some reason I think it's weirdly provocative. This is sort of, I think it's in the museum in Lyon, and it's a model with bronze objects on, and you just feel it's like, there's old painting Olympias who just stares back at you. So what do we understand as a feminine or masculine? We have sort of male, men, but also people also talk about masculinity, femininity, sexuality, the possibility of different conceptions in past society. And I think for us, the question of can we deal with this? Can we analytically deal with this? Do we have the insight to work with those questions, or are we just imposing upon the past? I think there are some really interesting boundary issues sometimes about, okay, it could well be that they didn't understand themselves as women, but can I argue that point, or do I just want to say it because it suits me? And then also the last thing is about moving this gender perspective into a wider aspect of the archaeological project. If we stay with burials and objects, what tension is it to do that when we actually want to say that gender is a thing that's underwrite society? It's part of how children grow up, it's part of how labor is organized, it would inform the nature of society, but we analyze it through death. So I think there's a really quite a big challenge about how to work on that much more invisible aspect of where those social relations get expressed. I think that was my last slide. So thank you very much.
Right. Thank you to both speakers for really inspirational and thought-provoking papers. That was really very, very interesting. Whether or not I'm able to give a synthesis of this, I'm not sure, but I thought I would draw out some themes at least. I thought I would start by the Oxford English Dictionary's definition of identity, and we can see if that is helpful at all in archaeology. The quality or condition of being the same in substance, composition, nature, or properties. Absolute or essential sameness, oneness. I'm not quite sure how that is going to help us archaeologically, and we can discuss that later. I thought that the clearer synergy between your papers was the question of scale. So can we go from an individual to society, from an individual body to the social body, in a sense? And how do we do that? Or in Louise's terms, personal identity versus social identity. And then I think there is a very interesting question underlying here. What is a body? Josepher has stated that the archaeological body is literally the past personified. And we've looked at different types of bodies, the adorned body, whether or not with beads or with belt boxes. We've talked about missing bodies, such as infants, for instance, who are often missing from the archaeological record, manipulated bodies, gendered bodies, etc. What is the body archaeologically, and how can we conceptualize that in terms of identity on different scales? And then, of course, the huge question of how identity is materialized in material culture, so the relationship between body and objects, as came up now. The question of life cycle and fluidity and transformation over time. And there are so many rich starting points for debate. I thought, however, that I would start by addressing something that we actually haven't really touched upon that much. And thinking particularly about individual identity now, the lower scale, as it were. I'm thinking about the debate on whether or not we can talk about individual identity in prehistory. There was a debate in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal in 2008 or somewhere around there. And Julian Thomas has repeatedly argued that the idea of the individual is modern, quite modern, developed within the last 500 years or so, and a very Western idea and an essentializing idea. Well, he argues that humanity is a practice rather than an essence. And then in response, there's an article by Nat and Bernard where they say that experiencing oneself as a living individual, we insist, is a part of human nature that is universal. Individualness is something universal through time, part of being human. So I thought I'd start with sort of a provocative question to you, and especially in light of current thinking in assemblages and relationality, individuality. Can we assume individual identity in the past? Big question.
It's a big question. I would say that the fact is that I don't know if we can speak about individual identity, but the fact is that we do have individual witness of maybe a more general group. So we have only individual skeleton, so we need to start by that, and I am sorry to say that we are all different, so we need to start by that in order to get maybe something that will tell us more about the universal identity. Yes, it's an Occidental concept, but it's a fact that all what we see in archaeology, that there is real individual action, and how to say, it's a bit difficult, but we can see that every graves, every skeleton is different, so this is something that we should start by. And I don't know how it was in their mind, but at least physically it's something we need to work on, and to start by that. It's not very clear, my answer. Sorry. Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's a very difficult question. I think it depends also a lot, because what one sees as time, because the question in some way and the debate usually implied that, of course, we are individual. But there's some point where there were, so what is the point where we see, so is it the pre-modern, and sort of historically I think everyone will put that boundary between when we become individual, self-conscious and so on. So I think it must depend a little bit as what one sees as the criteria. If it's just about experience, I think we have been individuals for a very long time. If it's about a social recognition of it, it may be a little bit more difficult to know when one would set that. So I think I find it always sort of interesting. It's like it's something we project from the present back as a question, as a concern in the past, and we want to make a division. And I don't know if it exists, and I don't know if just because, for example, so if one go back to Coherent, then there was a difference between individual and group-orientated society. But the group-orientated society doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have individuals as well, I think. It slightly depends on how we define it. So I can't answer that one.
Having knowledge from that present, have there been studies of present-day hunter-gatherers? I was thinking, there are those views, if you take things like the nature-culture aspects, where people say, well, some of these societies, they kind of wouldn't recognise the question, they don't have the terms, that everything's got a name, every plant, every animal, every whatever. So that's an issue where, if you like, if you went to them, and of course we think how was it in the past, but you know, again, it's the standard. If you step out of Western post-Enlightenment rationality, if you went up to these societies, they haven't got, in that instance, they don't. They seem to have very different concepts of the world and being part of the world and the animal part of the world and everything else. Do we have any sense at all, even in their language, the language of I and you, and do we have any sense from the way, from hunter-gatherers like that, of people who've looked at this sort of question about the self and the group?
I guess that's where people talk about the development of language.
Yeah.
If you don't have language, if you cannot express it, does it not exist? It's sort of that sometimes you get into this kind of argument. So if you're without language, you cannot articulate that reflection.
But in terms of in terms of studies of kind of historically known, linguistic studies and so on, of historically known, say hunter-gatherers, we can't impose those on the past, but people are operating in very different worlds. There've been a whole set of, say, ideas about how they were culture, nature, things like that. But this issue of self and group and personal identity, social identity. In other words, it's slightly coming in. If you'd asked that question to Jon Tufins, would they have understood the question? I don't know. And they might have, but we would have some sense of the other sorts of questions about nature and culture, where we think perhaps Nielsen and Tufins would think in this sort of way.
I think at least they knew which place they had in the society. And this is part of individual identity, even if it's not conscious. You know which place you have in the society, which place, what is your role, and that's part of individual identity, I think.
Yes. It's an interesting question as well, what you said, Marie-Louise, about the gender thing, and to continue with what Graham said. Now, I'll start by saying I started reading Marie-Louise when I was an undergraduate in Malta, and she was a revelation because no one was talking about gender. It was not allowed. You could talk about fertility goddesses, but not gender. And I remember my supervisor was quite annoyed when I was waving your book about. Amazon was a thing at the time. And since then, you're right, we've really evolved in how we look at it. And the more I look at, say, the corpus of figurines from Neolithic Malta, the more I realize how much we're imposing our ideas of gender. So for a long time, people were asking, why are there no female figurines in Malta? And I point out, yes, there are 2 or 3, and the rest are deliberately ambiguous. And that is what we should be focusing on. Try to understand how people were depicting their world. You know, so the questions that, it doesn't mean we're less of feminists or whatever, it means we're just trying to figure things out there. The second point I wanted to bring out about individuals and things like that, what I found interesting when I was working on Uragic bronzes in Sardinia, if you look at the corpus, they follow a certain pattern, in so far as there are patterns, and they're all made using the lost wax technique, etc., etc. But 4 of them, which look exactly like others of their type, have quite a bit of silver in them, unlike the others. And I think there is where we identify the metalsmiths doing their thing. And I don't know if it was them experimenting and not telling anybody, or them being rebels or whatever, but sometimes we find these things in the most unexpected of places. So for me, that's the takeaway I take from both your papers, that the most interesting things are coming when we look at things systematically, and then suddenly we think, you know, there's something we didn't think about.
I think to get back to your question, I think what I find interesting is that this is essentially an anti-essentialist kind of question, but the way it works in practice, it's also very essentialist. So assuming that the contemporary hunter-gatherers, they're this unspoiled unit, I think it's as biased. Yes, and also assuming the past is so different is also something we should question. And also what I find interesting, and a friend sent me once a quote by philosopher Castoriadis, talking about assemblages and criticizing, oh, we can't have like identity. If you need to have identities to make an assemblage. You can't have fuzzy things coming together into an assemblage, because that's not an assemblage. So I think maybe a more productive way would be exactly to see how would they, as you both stressed, how would they define their identity in certain things, and also being aware some things probably we'll never be able to tell. But I think, yeah, getting stuck into the question, oh, aren't we just imposing our view? I think it happens what happened with gender theory and feminist theory in archaeology. It got to a dead end in a way, because how do we move further if we just lock ourselves into a negation or saying stuff we can't do? Okay, but what can we do?
And can we move out of burials? That last point you made is sort of a kind of call to arms about can the subject move beyond? Are there any indications from any of these other great swathes of archaeological expertise that are not engaged?
There are people who work on labour, organizational labour, but they often work in a complex society where they have texts to support some of the argument. And of course, labour is very often gendered, but I think particularly not in complex society. So the question is whether in Neolithic society it was gendered. But we had a small workshop on it this summer, and because we're working on Sesselbata, and it is incredibly difficult. If you're honest, if you don't just want to impose, yes, of course the women did the pottery.
And yes, I mean, the kind of stuff we've got, isn't it? It's the micromorphology of floors and uses of space, and I mean, there's such a huge amount of archaeology, but it's at the moment you say people haven't penetrated it with those sorts of questions.
If we follow up on that, where do you think gender archaeology is going, since you had that as a forward point?
I thought that was a question to you, so I the answer. I actually think that all the genetics data and mobility data we're getting in, that would really be a very interesting wake-up call in terms of what kind of social models have we been working with. And I went to a meeting at the National Museum in Copenhagen because they've done a lot of DNA, and suddenly the patterns of what's supposed to happening is falling apart, but they're all sort of scientists, and you sort of get into discussion about that biological relation is not the same as social relations, and we have to understand the social. So I think that I think might provoke us to rethink things like taking for granted that you see families. It's also interesting how many studies now coming out showing that it's a father who's biologically related to the children, not the mothers, not the women. So I think we will have to rethink what we have thought about as family, what we have thought about the glue which tie people together in small scales, and mobility, and at what point in life people move, and if they move repeatedly. And so that I think could help us to rethink the identities and relationships. That I think would be one way.
Which comes down to what isotopes, strontium stuff on skeletal material. That's at the heart of what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, and which certainly give you access to time before death in many cases, in terms of this happened to them when they were children, and this happened there, and so on.
If you compare teeth and bones, it will give you different.
Yeah, so at least we open up the life of people rather than using everything in death.
Right.
So but I've thought particularly also the mobility, because so far a lot of women seem to be moving around in my period in the Bronze Age, which is very different to what we would have predicted. And that is quite healthy. It's actually quite healthy to be caught up at that you had made assumptions.
I thought there was often assumptions of women being moving as married. I thought, my sense is people have too often kind of said, well, it must be women as moving as married.
They actually, if one look at what people have argued, we had one kind of argument about women moving, but the long distance trade and metalsmith and all that were men.
Oh, right.
So we had two different ways of thinking about mobility in the Bronze Age, and I think we will have to rethink it all. So that is one. So that's not directly inside the discipline in terms of gender archaeology. I also think we'll have to. I think we also have to return to the issue about difference between sex and gender. and if we can study gender separate from sex bodies and how we do that.
I think Marie-Louise's point about these new methods is interesting. What I found challenging about the way that these kinds of results have been interpreted is that it very often falls back on, despite being a reworking of how we thought the societies functioned, falls back on being fixed somehow to fit with the gendered patterns we expected. So these women must be moving as marriage partners, or these men being buried with children, that must mean that their lineage is really important, and so the men must still have the power. So we have all this new information that we're turning, or somehow turning to fit our old models, which is a challenge and interesting, and I don't know how we get to unpick that. And perhaps it's because the people who are often doing those studies aren't the ones that are engaged really in gender research generally, they're just more engaged in the science side of it. So I think there needs to be a coming together of those sides. And it's similarly in how people are interpreting mass migration, the Bronze Age, or apparent mass migration, falling back on older ideas.
I agree, and we have to be careful about, because people come up with all this genetic data, and there's a habit, a nasty habit of conflating genetics with everything else. And I think we will need the social sciences to say, yo,
That's why I thought it would
people,
actually.
not genes,
That's why I thought if we engage with the debate, it might actually come back to gender archaeology, because the social is very different from the biological. And I thought it was very interesting when Eske gave his talk last year, the McDonald talk, that sense of they just have sex and move on kind of thing, which is a little bit different from, okay, there's a family and then this and so on, to be much more...
Literally move on
Yeah.
in this case.
Yeah. So, it's just interesting when we get new, as you say, if we don't just slot them into our interpretation, but actually have to try to use them to rethink something and see where we have just assumed things or been biased, or universalizing things which are more complex.
And also I think that the social behaviors will change already the biology of the body and the skeletons, but it's also changing the genes and all the DNA things, so we must really work together. It's not DNA should be really in relation with people of human social, because it has a strong interaction. So what we eat is making us changing also in terms of genes. And so it's very interacted. We can't work one on one side and the other one on the other side. We are making our body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is going to be important, you say, to try to get these two worlds together. Because at the moment you will have conferences which are just two ships passing the night. The Sangers just had an enormous conference on human evolution, and it was apparently 99% genetics, and two people who they invited to other aspects, including Marta. And in a way, I mean, they could see questions in their own data, but the sort of fundamentals were questioned. And it's, as you say, it's in the end, the biological and social have got to try to be confronted together in a really productive way.
Yeah.
It's very hard to actually orchestrate physically, isn't it?
Right. And I think if we do it well, that would also make us question our own assumptions, not just question them. So it could be dynamic in both directions.
So maybe we should do that. Get together and
And follow the first advice.
Other comments?
Actually, I think the Welcome Project is as good as an example, isn't it? With the one where we're working here, there's a lot of about 400 bodies were found in the redoing of the building opposite St John's where you're staying. And we've got a big project here, which in a way is trying to combine the biological and the social. And it's interesting, it's been funded by our main science funder, that the PI that they recognised is a colleague here who's a social archaeologist. And the whole case for the grant in many ways was we need to put these two things together to try to approach these. We need 400 people biographies, and we need, is the way they phrased it. And that's actually one example where explicitly it was seen from the beginning that had to be. It's not led by either side.
John.
I'm sorry, this was not in direct response. I was thinking in both talks there was an example of a sort of disability that may have been seen as a sense of social identification, the avulsion, is that? Yes.
That's been knock a tooth out, isn't it?
Yes.
Avulsion.
And also the leg ornaments for the women that were chained together, and those would have both been things that would have limited your ability, your physical ability to do certain things. What it was making me think was about how we often talk about or seem to assume that individual identity, if it is something that existed, would have been something that was self-defined or self-created, whereas we know from other points in history there are pieces of individual identities which are imposed upon people that may also be negative things. For instance, a scarlet letter. I was thinking about the teeth, if that was not a rite of passage but a punishment perhaps, or a marker, marking out someone in a bad way that the person wouldn't have chosen to be marked in that way, but other people chose to impose that individual identity upon them. So just thinking about how the individual identity might not be something that's self-defined or chosen.
Then you have to show if it's a negative or a positive sign and treatment, which is quite difficult unless you have something specific in the funeral practices that will let you know that. Yeah, you are right. The thing is that evolution is known all over the world, and we know that it's positive. For today, it's a positive thing, and it's a rite of passage. So it's the renunciation might be a punishment. I never thought about that. So it's I don't know, because it means also that it's punishment for life, forever. Is it something that is acceptable? I mean, it's very heavy in consequence. So can it happen that it means that the human is considered to never be able to recover from something he did wrong? Or it's very.
Because I've seen some grant proposals where people were trying to get at in different periods, Iron Ages or whatever, the excluded, the peculiar, the odd, and then virtually all found that simply because of the tiny quantities of data they could try to have to see any kind of pattern like that.
I think your basic point about identity not just being self-created, that it is part of a dynamic and dialogue with the social, I think is very important and very well taken. My case with the leg ankle vein, the thing which always make me think about is Chinese women's foot binding, which of course is not per se punishment. It might be controlled, but it's also prestige and so on. So I think one can have I know it's a scarring generally, and there are a lot of practices around the body which are actually in some way, in a physical sense, restricting or damaging that body and that you live with all life, but depending on the cultural norms are still something which are positive. So,
Hijab.
Sorry?
Hijab, I mean, look at that.
Yeah.
Elongating skulls.
Yeah. And I think that's a point Joanna Sophia also made, that sense of that the body is actually also a material culture that you manipulate. That's where we really have that interaction between the social and that individual.
And it might also have a link with you need to make an effort to be identified as a subgroup, so it's not like easy. So I think there's also something important that you need to suffer. It's not easy to be part of a group.
Yeah, I'm wondering if one way to start what Joanna's pointing out and move beyond the body as well is power, which didn't come up much in either talk, but is something well explored in the feminist literature. And I look at, perhaps Fanny can give a Levantine perspective on it. I work in Anatolia. But right now we've got quite a few people looking into violence in the Neolithic in Anatolia. And the assumptions are that violence is always physical. It's hitting someone over the head with something, it's doing bodily damage. And we might not put it in print, but we're assuming that it's macho, it's male activity. But of course we know power is much more than hitting people over the head with sticks. Permeates all manner of material culture, and is there a way to expand or to make our understandings of power, which involve a much greater range of material culture, which involve landscapes and ritual and everything, and to get that to engage with the gender archaeology and archaeology of the body in a more meaningful way?
I think your question is totally legitimate and important. We so often focus on power when we can see it in terms of its effect on the body. And what you are saying is both about its effect on the mind and on behavior and restrictions and the way in which you can make people feel. And I think for prehistory, we don't have very much access to it. Prehistoric Europe, we don't have that much access to it prior to the Iron Age. That, of course, doesn't mean it's not there. But we don't have, I think, enough evidence. We have, at one hand, you might have Stonehenge and all those kinds of structures, but you have very little insight in who had access, what level of control there were. So I think more what one have to take is maybe try to take your question so serious that research started to try to think about ways of addressing it. It's not that the data is self-evidently out there and we just haven't really used it. It is a surprising, there are now more work looking at trauma on prehistoric bodies, but there generally is not much trauma. But it doesn't mean you were not killed violently, because it doesn't all show on the skeleton. So maybe it's something about, getting hit on the head rather than cut with a sword, which means that we don't see them. But the prehistoric body don't show much trauma.
I mean, isotope, in a way, we're all trying to run too fast with both the carbon, oxygen, whatever isotope, sort of environment and diet stuff, and the, we should say, what Tamsin would say too, in the sense the archaeological questions and the storytelling is running fast ahead of the science, including the strontium thing. But again, potentially, if we really do get that point of understanding dietary life histories in communities and so on, then again, if you started to see both dietary similarities and dietary differences, that's another potential tiny insight into inclusion, exclusion, difference, which is what you're trying to get at.
I think one can, which is slightly different from whether it's power, but I think one can start to see a lot of situations that we would think would be very traumatic, like Stockheimer study, which suggests that boys very early on, like 5 years old, are all moved away, so things that we think would be really truly traumatic about breaking up our biological ties could be that they're much more common than we ever thought about before. And that is, of course, someone imposing, or society imposing, power over people's body, and we now want you to grow up in this community who we want to be friendly with, and so on. So that kind of thing we might see, so quite systematic controlling of people in that way.
I'm not familiar with the study. It's boys in particular.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So there they seem to have, they're done really detailed in a valley where they have a lot of data, and they seem to have totally different patterns between men and boys, men and girls and women. That the mobility pattern is totally different between them, and none of it totally makes sense sort of intuitively. Yeah, but that.
What period is that?
Sorry?
What period is that?
It's late Neolithic Greek of early Bronze Age. Yeah. They've got really very dense data, so it is quite fascinating. And so the women move in, but they have not yet found any children of the women who come in. The children, on the other hand, very early, the boys are moved out and then come back as adult men. So they're very complex, if it's correct.
How do they know they've moved out? Because the adults have the
because of the isotope in terms
Okay.
of
they have
that
a gap
X-span.
in their.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think we're still in a situation where it's a little like everyone says, like will couple 14 first came through, something like what calibration will have to happen. And so I think your question is really important, and I think unfortunately at present we can mainly answer it in terms of really obvious, as opposed to that much, which get you more to violence and to actually power.